let's give a go to the first question. It comes from John on Patreon. And I've summarized John's question roughly as being, what is consciousness? What's the right view to take about it? And what did philosophers in the past think? And John adds that if the consciousness question has been settled by thinkers like Wittgenstein or Nietzsche or Descartes, hasn't been answered by these great minds of the past, and I were a philosopher, John says, this will annoy me, at least in some kind of a low-level, everyday way, because if you sort that out, other things would follow. So I'm saying no, I'm not annoyed. And that's because what typically happens when you ask a good philosopher question isn't that they give you a different answer to the answer you thought was obvious. It's rather that your question begins to dissolve. Most questions most people have that are philosophical questions are misconceived. And the problem is always in the place of the question, not in the place of the answer. That's part of the reason why we call our conversations all over YouTube public intellectual rather than educational. Because education in the kind of conventional YouTube format presupposes, I want to know how to make an omelette and I need a video about how to do it. I already have my question, it's clearly set, and I don't need my question challenged. So I don't think the question of consciousness dissolves as obviously as some other questions dissolve, but I think it might dissolve to some degree. Brian McGee once asked me, and Brian did so much for public philosophy. You can find many of Brian's conversations on YouTube from the 1970s, 80s, and 60s. And Brian once asked me why I am uninterested in questions like, why is there something as opposed to nothing? And why am I preponderantly interested in questions about the empirical world? And Brian asked that knowing I wasn't interested in these questions. And part of the problem is that some questions that you typically find in introductory philosophical texts are indeed either misconceived or uninteresting. And I'm not saying that's entirely true about the questions about consciousness. It depends on what the questions are. But I think that is partly true of our public conversation about it, and to a lesser extent, partly true about the philosophical conversation about it. Now, to begin worrying about consciousness kind of seems to make sense, because it seems puzzling. I mean, look, there are self-aware beings who have agency, it seems, beings who act upon their environment, are acted upon by their environment, and yet these beings are part of nature. I mean, isn't this puzzling? How is the mind understood as something that humans occupy in an embodied way, reducible to the brain that we can explain via current or future scientific methods? Let's give a couple of cents about what might be the dissolution of at least some of these concerns. Now, sure, nothing happens in the world. And what you're now going to see is that we're probably going to chat for 2 or 3 minutes, and it's not going to be a philosophy in action, it's going to be description of philosophy in action. But still, it's a kind of interesting spectacle which slightly deviates from what comfortably feels like dinner table conversation. So watch it. If you feel like you want more and more depth and more even technical clarity, then do feel free to jump over to the philosophy channel. But I do still recommend against it for the majority of us in this community. So, look, nothing happens that's not physical. There aren't two substances. Everything is physical. But at the same time, there are also mental events and mental processes. And they are consistent with the fact that everything is physical. There is no inconsistency there. There is no incompatibility between our mental experiences and our scientific explanation of the world. But our mental experiences aren't reducible to physical explanation. They aren't reducible to scientific explanation. But hang on, I've just said that everything is physical. So how does this work? I think that where you've got to start is by making a distinction between the spectator's perspective, if you like, the perspective of somebody who is trying to make sense of the world scientifically, and the perspective of an agent who is acting in the world, leading a life in the world, operating in the world in an embodied way. So what we're saying is that there is one reality, but there are two different interests, two different perspectives that constitute irreducible ways of explaining the world. Now, some mental experiences are going to be very straightforwardly related, we could guess, to what might be neurological, neurophysiological, physical explanation. Right? The fact that I recognize that the iPhone on which I'm recording this is rectangular and not round is certainly tied to some physical events and physical processes, and the relationship between my experience of this and a scientific explanation of it might indeed not be very tenuous. But what if we shifted and started talking about a different kind of experience? My experience of being in love, or my experience of recognizing that one interpretation of Beethoven's Fourth Symphony is greater than another. What if I say that Willem Furtwängler's recording from 1942 or 43, I don't remember which, of the Fourth Symphony is the greatest one, and that his control in the opening bars demonstrates a mastery of transitions unsurpassed in the history of recorded sound. Now, you see, what a lot of people in our culture, scientific commentators on YouTube, members of the intellectual dark web, evolutionary psychologists might say, well, yes, of course we can't explain that now, but give us 2 or 3 centuries and then we can explain this scientifically. No. It's an absolutely elementary scientific error and prejudice to think that my recognition that one Beethoven recording is greater than another is in principle going to be something that could be explained from the spectator's point of view, from the point of view of our best naturalistic scientific explanation of the world. There is an irreducibility there. That the substance of the explanation of why Willem Furtwängler's 1942 recording is greater than others is going to be too local, too parochial, too tied up with what it means for an embodied being to engage with the world, to ever be susceptible to scientific explanation. So there is a very basic point here that is not a matter of being patient with where science takes us. What it means to explain the world from the point of view of an agent living a life, an agent with purposes, by the way, that is never going to be scientifically explicable. Not because something is flawed with science, but because that's too local, parochial, and embodied an interest for science to be involved in. Science is interested in explanations of a higher level of uptake of generality. John's got a second question, and it's what is going on with the fact that there isn't Chinese or Indian or Western science, there's just science, but why are there different philosophical traditions, and why there's such a thing as Western philosophy? Science is interested in explanations of the most general uptake, or at least of general uptake. Philosophy isn't. Philosophy is often interested in very parochial, local, cultural, psychological explanations. They are explanations of whatever level of generality is appropriate to explain that thing that's being explained. So, while, for instance, physics, as some people argue, you don't need to be committed on anything on that debate, but as some people argue, like my great colleague Adrian Moore, who wrote a book called Points of View a couple of decades ago, and he argued in that book that in principle it's a coherent proposal to say that physics today or the physics of the future could give us absolute representations of the world as it is independently of perspective. Well, if that were true, then one thing that quite certainly wouldn't be part of such representations would be philosophy. Philosophy's concerns are much less general than that. Rich says, could you teach us how to think deeply and make a video about that? Well, no, I can't, because you need to teach that yourself. But and I will make a video about that, probably on the Philosophy channel. But let me just mention a couple of things very quickly. There are things about philosophy, but they're things that have relevance to our everyday thought. The point about philosophers isn't that they're supposed to get things right, it's that they're supposed to have wherewithal. So let's give an example. I am personally working on the political concept of freedom. So what does that mean? It means that I know every single thing that's been said about freedom in the history of the West. And that means that if you are talking about freedom, you likely, unless you're an intellectual historian or a political philosopher, you likely don't know what all of these options are. And when you say, well, I think freedom is this, what will be happening is that you'll be choosing from a limited palette. Yeah? And you could make the best choice out of that palette, but your palette will be limited. Whereas the professional thinker about freedom will know everything that there is to choose from. They could still make the wrong choice, but at least they have that wherewithal. It'd be the same as the difference between an amateur and a professional pianist. The professional pianist might play something very badly, but what they'll know is that there are 200 things that one can do with this note, given what this piece is asking, the piece they're playing. And the amateur pianist will just have 7 choices. And even if they choose the best of the 7, that might still be nowhere near the right choice. So there is this kind of sense of self-awareness and wherewithal that's important. And if one doesn't have that in a certain area, like I don't have it in almost all areas of human expertise, it's healthy to be conscious of that. Sparkling Soda wrote a little paragraph or 2 about relativism. And I do think that what you've written is a tiny bit confused, and I think you might think that what you've written is confused, but what you think isn't. And that's not true. What you think about this is confused. But I'm not going to sort of critique you. Let me just put a couple of things out there. And it's really a comment about relativism or perhaps subjectivism and how one gets to any degree of objectivity in moral judgment. So let me just put a couple of quick things on the table. First of all, relativism in practice is an unavailable gambit, because as soon as there is a confrontation between two parties or two different cultures or two different subcultures, there is no longer the possibility to talk about an us and a them. There is a new we to be negotiated. So the idea that this is right for us and that's right for them simply doesn't make sense, with one exception. Unless you're talking about other human beings who belong to a group you're never going to meet, right? So if we're talking about the court of Ivan the Terrible, right, there is then more room for relativism, because this is a bunch of humans we ain't gonna encounter and we ain't gonna negotiate anything with them. That's one thing I want to put on the table. The second thing I want to put on the table, I think, is that there can be a tendency to say something like this. everything is relative and there isn't anything objective we can say about ethics, and therefore we should sort of just tolerate each other's perspectives. Now, that's obviously a logical mistake, right? Because you are making a non-relativistic claim as a follow-up to postulating relativism. Because there is nothing you can say about ethics. You quite certainly can't say that we should all tolerate each other equally or reasonably. Nothing follows about what we should do. Let me say one more thing, a third thing. What shall it be? I think it could be this. There are universal values. There are even universal political values. We've talked about one of them on the channel, freedom. If you don't think that freedom is a universal value, you're just wrong. And justice is a universal value. If you don't think that justice is a universal value, you're just wrong. Now, the way these values express themselves in different cultural circumstances is very different. But that doesn't stop it being the case that these values are universal. Let me add a couple of quick things too. There are, of course, some things that human beings, this can be a fourth point, just don't want. Human beings don't want certain things. Human beings don't want to be in pain. Human beings don't want to be hungry. Human beings don't want to be taken advantage of. Human beings don't want those around them to be unreliable. Just go on and on and on and on. So there are clearly some universal things, the universal human negatives, universal human evils. And there are also some universals about what makes humans flourish, what makes humans have a good life. Is there something else we can throw very, very quickly in? There are so many things, so we'll just leave it at that for the moment. Oh, one thing very quickly is worth saying. Ethical experience is full of things that are independent of the will. Yeah, you can't decide whether to feel remorse or shame about something, right? You can't decide whether you feel compelled about taking a certain ethical stance or taking a certain action, because you experience these as kind of pools that are independent of the will, as independent of the will as anything you can imagine, indeed. So this is not a matter of decision. Okay, enough throwing paint at the canvas. Shandi says, can you say something about explaining things at the individual level versus explaining them at the collective level? Now, when we're talking about individualism versus more collective explanation, in this case, we're talking about explanatory approaches. We're not talking about ethics or morality, so don't confuse this with moral individualism. We're just saying, in the course of events, when we causally explain events and historical occurrences, how much is it about individuals or how much is it about cultures, institutions, bigger things, and so on? Let's take a couple of extreme positions. And they're both obviously wrong. One position says that individual states, individual intent doesn't fundamentally explain anything because it's bigger processes, bigger structures that offer the true explanation of why things happen. The logical consequence of being so silly as to think that is that you would have to insist that if Shakespeare didn't write his plays, somebody else would have written those exact same plays. If somebody wasn't answering Shandi's question, if I wasn't answering Shandi's question, somebody else would have been answering Shandi's question. Somebody else would have asked Shandi's question. That's obviously absurd. And On the other extreme, you've got some sort of epistemically casual libertarians who might say, well, you know what? It's only individual states and individual intent that explains everything. Institutions don't matter. There's cultural explanations don't matter. Sociology doesn't matter. I mean, please. So the sensible view here is that collective action, right, explanations of action at the collective level are inseparable from explanations at the individual level. You're always going to end up spending some of your time talking about the intentions of individuals, even if they are part of very complex organizations with their own ways of ticking along. But what you always going to need is both, really, when you're trying to explain history. And so these two extremes fall away. There are lots of questions here. Let me just take one more. Is individual knowledge acquisition actually an illusion, since we are so dependent or interdependent as beings, and we're always reliant on others for shaping our understanding of the world? Yeah, we are reliant on others for shaping our understanding of the world, but we can always ask whether what we think is accurate, true, and whether our approach is truthful. Gerald, hi. Thank you for your support on Patreon. You say, I have in my 72 years on Earth encountered the pattern that we have behaved more superficially recently. I have observed a steady increase in superficial behavior. So why can't I therefore say that we've become more superficial? And there's a little video, I think, on the main channel that basically says this. No, modern humans haven't become more superficial. They've come to live as though they were superficial when they're not. Now, we are neurophysiological units. And over and above that neurophysiology sits a certain kind of psychology. That psychology has a shape. And the shape of it involves a certain level of depth to that psychology. It involves certain particular features, like the way human beings relate to their past and their present and their future. You can go on filling out that picture. You might fill it out with something psychoanalytic. And that picture is age-old. The degree to which our basic psychology changes over a short period of time is very, 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 very minor. So the idea that human beings are more superficial today than 100 years ago is just incompatible with evolutionary theory. And it's incompatible with any plausible account of human psychology. But there is such a thing as us being in an evasive relationship with the depth that we have, right? So when you've got two children and one child is constantly posing naked on Instagram and the second child is reading Shakespeare and they're both 16, first of all, it's not clear that the Instagram kid's living more superficially. It's just not, because maybe the other 16-year-old is just reading Shakespeare terribly badly and not understanding any of it. But even if you did say that there is a kind of evasiveness and a kind of, bogus irony or whatever else to the 16-year-old that's constantly naked on Instagram, what you would say about that kid is that they are looking away from what's inside them, rather than saying that what's inside them is somehow shallow or diminished and so on. We can't lose our depth via some kind of cultural development that occurs over a period of decades, but we can come to live as though we don't have the depth that we do. So that's just a couple of cents. I hope that's adequate.